Furnace, widely considered as being one of the worst cards in Clash Royale history, not just in terms of power level, but also as a contributor to the game. This has been in the game for a long time, and although it's never been excessively strong in the competitive scene, it's gotten especially bad in the last few years thanks to Supercell's constant neglect. It's been about 3 years since Furnace has seen any real competitive use, and it doesn't seem like that's going to change anytime soon. So, what happened? Why is this card considered to be such a bad addition? What led to Supercell to stop giving it buffs when it desperately needed them? And why does the community not want this card to be buffed? Today, I'm going to be answering all those questions as we journey through the history of the Furnace. So what exactly is the point of Furnace? What was it meant to be? It was added on May 3rd, 2016 as a new 5 elixir building. This was going to be Clash Royale's 4th spawner building. There were buildings that spawned barbarians, spear goblins, and skeletons, and Supercell had been experimenting with other troops that could spawn from buildings, and ultimately decided that the new Fire Spirit troop would work excellently as a spawnable unit. Fire Spirits had the unique ability of dying as part of their attack, so this alone helped separate it from all the other spawners. A big problem with spawners at the time was that you could stack so many of them, which would lead to these massive swarms with dozens of units on the field at once. Furnace wouldn't contribute to this problem, since even if the spirits weren't responded to, they would take themselves out sooner or later. It was looking like this was going to be one of the more bearable spawners to go against thanks to this. Naturally, like any spawner though, the Fire Spirit troop it spawned was present in another card, so anytime the troop was changed, it affected both of them. This would undoubtedly cause some problems, as we'll get to. In total, if uninterrupted, this card would last 50 seconds, spawning 6 waves of 2 Fire Spirits. Each Fire Spirit did enough to take out anything up to the health of a goblin. 2 of them combined could deal with some heftier troops. The first wave came out instantly, so it was a reliable reaction area against pushes with swarms in them. It also had quite a few hit points, having the exact hit points as damage a rocket dealt, so using any spell on it wouldn't give you adequate value. This amount of hit points made it a solid defense against many building targeting units. Now, one thing to know about Fire Spirits is that although they're very fast, they're also very fragile, so when uninterrupted, the Princess Tower would actually take one of them out before it could reach the tower, and the second one could only make it because of the first one tanking for it. This meant you would have to support them if you wanted to get value out of the second spirit. Now, spawners have always been hated in Clash Royale more than most cards, so adding another one was a bit of a risk. The reason being that you basically place them, and then for 50 to 60 seconds, the opponent just has to carefully take out each wave without overcommitting. It was seen as very lazy on the spawner player's part. It just took way more skill to counter spawners than it was to play them. Even though it seems like they were trying to make this spawner feel more like Tombstone, the fact it could damage the tower on its own was going to make players frustrated. Even just one Fire Spirit connecting per wave was something you couldn't really ignore, and that was enough to make it annoying. Tombstone was the one spawner that wasn't really hated since it couldn't chip towers on its own, so already this card wasn't built in the best way. Comparing this to Goblin HUD, for the same cost, they had the same hit points, but if uninterrupted, a Furnace did way more damage overall to a tower. Clearly they were trying to make this building more offensive than other spawners. It makes sense they would design the card this way because in the first 2 months of Clash Royale, buildings were very prominent, causing defense-heavy decks to thrive, leading to a lot of draws, and that wasn't healthy. There hadn't even been a single new building card released since the game's beta launch. Furnace was the first new one. Now, Supercell was correct in analyzing that building-heavy defense metas are not fun, and they should balance the game to ensure an environment like that does not exist. But in the spawner's case, it's just as or even more annoying when they're good on offense. Looking at the initial reactions, it was overwhelmingly negative. Nobody wanted another spawner in the game. Just analyzing what people hated about spawners the most and seeing these initial reactions makes it very easy to understand why Supercell gave it the treatment it ended up getting for years. But let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. Sure, the reaction was negative preemptively, and this card had problems already, but how was the card upon release? Well, there's not much data from this time, but on May 5th, 2016, we can see it had a 6% use rate in the top 100, which sounds okay by today's standard, but at this time this was far below average, indicating it was quite weak. It was barely better than a Goblin HUD, and Goblin HUD was already one of the worst cards. It's safe to say it was a soft launch. It was kind of unfair because the other spawners at least had their day, but Furnace was screwed right from the start. It really called into question why they added this card in the first place. Of course, some cards are going to be weak on launch, but this card is built very similarly to other spawners, and those other spawners were left to rot for a reason. Every option didn't seem logical. The possible paths basically are, you add a card that's bad right from the start and leave it bad because spawners are unhealthy, calling into question its existence, or you add it and make it really good, forcing a specific mechanic to be viable when you could have just buffed the already existing spawners to have a similar effect. or make Furnace really good and buff the other spawners, making everyone upset. Supercell wants every new card to thrive to see what a meta with that card looks like, so a buff seemed imminent, but it seemed pretty obvious Furnace was not going to have an easy journey. It really makes me feel like this card was just added as part of a quota, and Supercell didn't think of the problems a card like this would inevitably bring. It felt like they kinda just added whatever in 2016, so I wouldn't be surprised if this was the case. But anyway, it would only be about 2 weeks from launch for Furnace to receive its first balance change, and this was a pretty big one. Its elixir cost was being reduced from 5 to 4. This was smart because we already had a 5 elixir spawner and not a 4 elixir one, so it filled a new role now. Along with this, however, its hit points were lowered by 14% and its lifetime was lowered by 10 seconds. This 10-second reduction was huge because it spawned each wave 9.9 seconds apart, and before this, it was designed perfectly so that it would spawn the last wave right before it expired. So not only were you losing a full wave, but the new last wave would only have enough time to spawn one fire spirit, which, as you know, did not need to be responded to on its own. So effectively you were losing 2 waves, or 1/3 of them, which was pretty huge even for the cost reduction. There would be one more change applied to Furnace in this rework though, which was increasing the fire spirit's splash radius from 1.2 to 1.5 tiles. It was nice, but since Furnace was mainly used for chipping towers, this didn't really matter much. Ultimately, this rework was a failure. The goal of it was to help Furnace, but the nerfs were overkill. It was a weak card already, and it just somehow became so much worse. Almost instantly after this, its use rate dropped to 0%. The card had been nothing but a disaster so far. It had an annoying mechanic, a weak launch, and a devastating rework all within its first few weeks. It was probably the most unsuccessful card release up to this point. Supercell wasn't giving up on it yet though. About a month later, on June 21st, 2016, Furnace would appear in the balance changes once again. In this set of changes, its lifetime would be reverted back to 50 seconds, so now it could once again spawn 6 full waves. This was huge, but definitely needed. In their explanation, they explained that adding 10 seconds to the lifetime would potentially allow for stacking of multiple furnaces, leading to some slow push gameplay. The amount of lifetime and health you got per elixir now made this one of the easiest spawners to stack after this, and this would be great in helping to control matches. This kind of stacking seemed like the type of thing they wanted to avoid before, but since it had less hit points than other spawners, troops that died quicker, and because they wanted this card to just see some viability, this change feels more understandable. So now with all this, could the Furnace finally be competitively viable? The answer is yes. Very quickly, you saw Furnace rising in minor cycle decks, this one being the most popular. It was also somewhat commonly seen in Royal Giant decks, but for now that was mostly in less competitive areas of the game. Minor decks were all about gradually chipping your opponent's towers down over time, and Furnace was a perfect accomplice to this strategy. It was used in nearly 1/5 of top ladder decks at the beginning of July, easily making it not just the most used spawner, but the second most used building. It provided just the right amount of offensive and defensive value for it to be good in a wide variety of circumstances. Furnace finally had its time in the spotlight, but could it last? It was a spawner after all, and its prominence in the meta was already garnering some hate. But it seemed to be in a better position than other spawners because it wasn't dragging out matches like they often did. It promoted very aggressive, offensive gameplay, which is what Supercell likes. Unfortunately though, even with no direct nerfs, Furnace would fall out of the meta by August. Minor Cycle was really the only deck it was ever appearing in top ladder, and that whole archetype was only increasing in popularity, so it doesn't seem to make much sense. One major factor was thanks to the Goblin Barrel rework in July. Minor Cycle decks began to include this as a secondary source of chip damage, negating the need for Furnace. You also had the addition of Bowler at this time, which was a naturally good counter to all spawners. Goblin Barrel fizzled out by the end of August, leading to a small comeback of Furnace usage, but it still wasn't an ideal environment for this card. Only 5 out of the top 100 players were using it, and this was the one and only deck used by those players. This was the same deck it was popular in before, just with minions instead of spear goblins. And once again, this wasn't popular for long. In September and October, Furnace saw almost zero top ladder play. It didn't begin to see another rise until November, where it started making waves in this minor Zap bait deck, as well as this Royal Giant deck. Both of these decks had swarm cards very susceptible to Zap, and that was for a reason. Zap was extremely influential around this time, so it was important to build your deck around that. The decks Furnace was used in were built in a way to bait the Zap on one thing so that it couldn't be used on another card, so that said card could get lots of value. Zap was a strong counter to Fire Spirits, which made it a natural fit. Even though Goblin Hut also spawned units vulnerable to Zap, it was one more elixir and overall just not very good. Being able to stack multiple of them on the field at once was the key to a viable spawner. This is exactly what the devs were trying to do according to their explanation from its last buff. Purely on a competitive statistical basis, it was in an excellent position, but it still wasn't settling. At the end of November, Tombstone was nerfed. More specifically, it spawned skeletons more infrequently. This was not only good because they were competitors, but because Tombstone had been a very strong counter to Furnace. Overall, you'd get way more skeletons per Tombstone than Fire Spirits per Furnace, and one Fire Spirit would only take out one skeleton with the way they were staggered out, which was horrible, especially because you were paying more for Furnace. So after this nerf, this Royal Giant Furnace deck became the most popular deck on top ladder, and Furnace overall was used in 1/4 of decks in that range. Royal Giant unfortunately took a nosedive in competitive play following a massive Elite Barbarians buff in December, but Furnace was still fine. Regular Giant Beatdown was still going strong, and although it had been mainly running Tombstone, you were seeing more Furnace subbed in thanks to Tombstone's dwindling popularity. It was interesting to see Furnace be treated more like a Tombstone than Barb and Goblin Hut, which had rotted at the bottom, receiving no love whatsoever since the Furnace's introduction. And it's not like this card wasn't hated. It was obnoxious to play against for many and way harder to counter than it was to play. The defender could get positive trades, but the timing and placements to accomplish this was way harder than it was for the Furnace player to get value, and that just didn't seem fair. This is actually what made Furnace become a more popular mid-ladder choice than top ladder. A top ladder player can dictate and know exactly how and when to counter waves and when to let them go, whereas a mid-ladder player will just see Fire Spirits and place whatever they need to stop them, giving a major elixir advantage to the opponent. But whether you were top or mid-ladder and you were playing Furnace, you would simply play it and let the opponent do all the work in countering it. The only real decision you needed to make is whether to place it in the center or the back. Going into 2017, we started to see the rise of spell bait decks. This was an archetype really only beginning to take shape, and in some of its earliest iterations, the Furnace was included. As you can see, there wasn't a solid win condition in these decks. The primary ways of getting tower damage was to simply stack Furnaces and spam Goblin Barrels, knowing the opponent couldn't efficiently counter all of it. You did see some dips in Furnace usage as Tombstone was making a comeback as the preferred spawner, but Furnace still had a solid place in the meta thanks to the rise of all these swarms. By the end of January, it was still used in 30% of top ladder decks, seeing use in plenty of Swarm Bait, Giant, and Royal Giant decks. It had pretty much phased out of minor control by now. Over the next few months, Logbait would evolve to no longer include Furnace, but Giant and Royal Giant would continue to use it frequently. Even though Furnace's last balance change happened about 9 months prior to this point, it still wasn't really settling. Its usage was on a downward spiral from January through March, and finally by April, it had hit rock bottom. 0% of top ladder players were using it. Royal Giant and Giant had just been fizzling out, while win conditions that Furnace didn't really fit in, like Graveyard, Three Musketeers, and Lava Hounds, thrived. This was easily the lowest point it had been at in 6 months. So of course, it's the same time Supercell would decide it's the best time for a Furnace nerf. That's right, on April 19th, 2017, Furnace's health would be decreased by 5%. The timing of this is so weird to me. This card was used in 20 to 30% of top ladder decks for months, and they decide to do nothing about it. But suddenly when it's out of the meta, you bring the nerf hammer? Now, the card certainly wasn't completely dead, but this just felt like the wrong time. Diving deeper into the context behind this change though, it appears there may have been a different reason for this nerf. You see, this card was hated a lot. It didn't matter if it was performing badly, it was annoying. Even if it was barely used in competitive play, it was still very popular along with the Royal Giant in mid to lower trophy ranges. Thanks to its lower rarity and low skill floor, it could still be really strong in the right environment, which frustrated players. Okay, but why now? As I've stated before, people were hating on Furnace before it was even officially released. It's not like this hate was sudden. Well, Supercell had almost always been balancing around top ladder and challenge statistics, which makes sense because those are environments where cards are always equal level going against each other and all cards are pushed to their fullest potential. But they seem to be stepping away from that approach. Because you see, Elite Barbarians and Royal Giant both received nerfs despite both of them having very weak stats competitively. They were mainly nerfed due to community pressure. Pretty much any official Clash post from December 2016 through March 2017 had complaints under it berating Supercell to do something about Elite Barbarians and Royal Giant. The backlash was so intense that Supercell finally gave in because they were just ruining the game for too many players. Since the team was now listening to the loudest parts of the community, Furnace was nerfed to appease them. It was nerfed not only when its use rate was at rock bottom, but since Royal Giant was getting nerfed as well in the same set of changes, and that was the main win condition it was seen with, it was going to have a tough time thriving even in mid-ladder, forget about competitive play. Supercell also explains in the changes that they wanted to see a bit more balance between Goblin Hut and Furnace. It's strange that it took them this long to care about Goblin Hut because it certainly hadn't been making any waves before. As you can imagine, following these changes, Furnace was pretty much dead. It wasn't completely gone from the competitive scene, but it was clear that there were way better options. For the next few months, its use rate in top ladder hovered around 0 to 2%. Furnace wouldn't really see any more development in 2017. It was performing a tad better in December, partially thanks to the Inferno Tower nerf, but by then Goblin Hut had taken over as the clear spawner of choice. It didn't seem like Furnace could make a real comeback without proper buffs, and being a spawner, that was going to be a tough sell. 2018 was a very tough year for the Furnace. 2017 had provided an exceptionally good environment for Furnace because so many swarms were consistently viable ever since the Great Zap nerf at the beginning of the year. But in December, the Logbait archetype took a major hit because so many of the cards that were making it popular got the nerf hammer. Following this and some overbuffs to the Dark Prince in February 2018, there was a major rise of beatdown and high tempo decks, which is a really bad environment for spawners, because they usually need to be on the battlefield for a while to get value. And Fire Spirits are the worst troop to have in a Prince-filled meta because when running up to each other, Spirits can't even stop a Prince's charge. During this period, Furnace went several months without appearing in even a single top 200 finishing ladder deck. It seemed like there was no hope for the card, until July, where Furnace would get the first balance change it's gotten in over a year. This was thanks to the card it was tied to, Fire Spirits. Players may not have been a huge fan of Furnace, but the Fire Spirits card was a different story. Both cards had been underperforming for a while now, so a buff to the troop made sense. This would be a simple damage increase of 5%. Nothing huge, but a buff is a buff. This change was just enough so 3 Fire Spirits could take out a Flying Machine. Obviously this was meant for the Fire Spirit trio. There weren't any major interaction changes from just 2 Fire Spirits, which is what matters for the Furnace. The reaction to this change was anything but positive. Most people either opposed it or just didn't care. Although it certainly needed buffs to be viable in the competitive scene, there were still some solid arguments against buffing it that weren't just people whining about how annoying it was. There were plenty of people just whining about it, but some argued that a buff this small to a card this weak wouldn't be enough to make it viable. The only real effect this would have is making overleveled Royal Giant players dominate in mid-ladder even harder. I can see that perspective, but I don't think Supercell should be keeping cards dead just to keep a subsection of casual players happy, especially when the biggest problem was overleveled Royal Giants, not the Furnace itself. As you would probably expect, following these changes, the card was still not doing too well. It hardly made a difference, but the buff was enough to recapture a few players' interest. In the final few months of the year, it was used in 3 to 4% of Grand Challenge decks with its win rate hovering around the 40s, which is below average, but far from the worst. The buff seems to help a little bit, but I think the slight increase in usage came more from the other environmental factors. The high tempo decks had been toned down, and Tombstone got another nerf in November. This plus the buff made the card feel like it had potential again. It actually seemed to be in the perfect position for what you'd want from this particular card. A little below average, but still viable in the right deck. Over time, people would continue to experiment and play around, and by January, Furnace's Grand Challenge use rate was the highest it was in years, and its win rate hit 50%. It wasn't below average, but it wasn't above average. It was average. You pretty much only saw it with Royal Giant, which was actually appearing a lot more in competitive play again thanks to a rework from the previous October. Not only were they appearing often together, but Furnace had pretty much solidified itself as a staple of Royal Giant. Almost every top Royal Giant deck had Furnace in it and vice versa. Royal Giant wasn't even a statistically broken card that was in danger of getting nerfed. Its rates were about the same as Furnace. They were just 2 cards that supported each other a healthy amount. Overleveled Royal Giants weren't even an issue anymore since the rework, so the problem of overleveled accompanying Furnaces was lessened. 2019 was off to a great start for this card. It was thriving in its own right, and its rates could not have been more average. Even though that July buff was more so meant for the Fire Spirits card, it seems like it was exactly what the Furnace needed. So being tied to another card actually benefited Furnace in this case, because I don't think it would have gotten that change without Fire Spirits. Now, even though Furnace was primarily seen with Royal Giant, it was seeing a little bit of play in Graveyard. Furnace's rates were still pretty much tied to Royal Giant during this era though, and it did have some dips, especially in August after the P.E.K.K.A. surge. In September though, Royal Giant had a bump in usage thanks to the Fisherman's surge in popularity, which ultimately led to more Furnace usage. The following month though, the meta would undergo a major shift, but surprisingly, even though Royal Giant fell out of the meta, Furnace's rates stayed about the same. You see, in October, Witch and Night Witch were very popular, which meant there were a lot of skeletons and bats flooding the arena that fire spirits could help deal with. Wall breakers were also very prominent this season, and 2 fire spirits were enough to wipe them out, meaning Furnace was a decent reactionary to them because you'd instantly get 2 elixir worth of value, then 5 more waves that needed a response. You saw a lot more Graveyard running Furnace this month, and some Elixir Golem Witch decks were running it too, mainly because those cards were everywhere. The developments were not done yet, however. Furnace would take another massive hit just the following month, thanks to the meta drivers being toned down. Swarms were very scarce in this environment because it was a splash-heavy meta with Executioner, Baby Dragon, Poison, and Magic Archer all dominating. Furnace just wasn't necessary. This continued into December. The card had a generally strong year throughout, but as I said, the meta changes. So even though Furnace got no balance changes whatsoever in 2019, it wasn't able to adapt to this ever-changing landscape. 2020 was probably the most interesting year for Furnace, not because it had an overperformance though, quite the contrary. Going into the year, Furnace was actually the best performing spawner. Furnace still worked alright with Royal Giant, but not much else. Tombstone was usually the preferred spawner in Graveyard during this time, and Barb and Goblin Hut didn't really have a place. But all of this was about to change. In February, Barbarian Hut would receive a rework to spawn units upon death, guaranteeing more value per placement. This boosted the spawner's popularity and didn't have a huge impact on Furnace's performance, but that following April, Goblin Hut would get a similar rework. So now Barbarian and Goblin Hut were the dominant spawners thanks to these reworks, and Goblin Hut was a bigger competitor to Furnace than Barb Hut was, so you saw a direct correlation of rising and falling performances following the boom of Goblin Hut usage. The rise of these spawners also led to a boom of Earthquake usage, which was a hard counter to Furnace, so yet again, it was a terrible environment for it. Now, there was a glaring inconsistency with spawners, that being that they all spawned units upon death except for Furnace. Tombstone was the first to have it, then Barb Hut got it, then eventually Goblin Hut, so the natural next step seems to be to give Furnace the same style of rework, but that's not exactly the approach they would take. Furnace would appear in the balance changes in May 2020, and it wasn't good news. Its hit points were going to be decreased by 16%. I don't think anybody really saw this coming. That is a really harsh nerf, especially for a card that was underperforming so much. Even before the other spawners started rising, Furnace's rates were far below average. So what was the reasoning behind this? Well, luckily we have Seth, the community manager, who shared the thought process behind this change. In his explanation, he admits that Furnace was not doing well in competitive play, but that it was frustrating to deal with and overused in mid-ladder. This explanation doesn't really make sense, and many players even called him out on it. How can you justify nerfing a card just because it's frustrating in a non-competitive area of the game? If that's the way you want to go, why not nerf Wizard, Mega Knight, Expo, or Hog Rider? These cards were way more overrepresented in mid-ladder, got way more backlash, and they were already doing better than Furnace in competitive play. Furnace was a bottom 10 card in April 2020. Singling it out here wasn't fair or consistent. That's why I totally understand the frustration and confusion from Furnace players. Now, this wasn't the whole story. Earthquake was receiving a building damage nerf, meaning it was sort of an indirect buff to all buildings. A buff that the team didn't want Furnace to get. Both Barbarian Hut and Goblin Hut's health were being toned down partially because they were too strong, but also to keep them bad against Earthquake. And actually, Furnace and Goblin Hut would have the same number of hit points after this, so it seems like this nerf was mainly for consistency. But even the consistency argument is flawed. If you want consistency, why not give the Furnace death units like the others? Go all the way if you're gonna do it. Other spawners got death units in exchange for their health, but Furnace just gets nothing? This is just one of many examples of Supercell being incredibly biased against spawners. So yeah, do I even need to explain how Furnace performed after this? After this change, any moderately high source of damage could easily prevent 1 or 2 more waves from spawning, which makes a huge difference. The card was easily in the worst position it was ever in now. I'd argue even compared to its original 5 elixir form. You just don't take away nearly 1/5 of a bottom 10 card's hit points without any compensation. Earthquake was not going anywhere either. Even with spawners less prominent in the meta, it was a very popular spell. Furnace wasn't just a bottom 10 card now, it was easily bottom 5 at least, if not bottom 3. in mid-August 2020, it was recorded as having the second lowest use rate and second lowest win rate in Grand Challenges. Weirdly enough, in the first couple months following the nerf, it was actually still the best performing spawner in general ladder. Still wasn't that great, and of course it didn't last, but it was interesting to see nonetheless. Furnace would receive one more balance change in 2020, which would come in September. This was a simple 0.2 of a tile splash radius increase to the Fire Spirit troop. The Fire Spirit's card wasn't just as bad or even arguably worse positioned than the Furnace was, so this wasn't a surprise. But according to their explanation, they already had future plans to rework the Fire Spirit's card into a solo Fire Spirit, which made this splash radius increase a bit odd. Nevertheless, it would be interesting to see how Furnace was affected by this inevitable Fire Spirit rework. Even though this buff didn't help much, it was relieving to players to know Furnace had an inevitable future development that could potentially save it. This was a very small adjustment though, that had no significant interaction changes. Personally, I think the reason this buff came when it did was because the Lost and Crowned film was being released this month, and Fire Spirits had a significant role in it. So I could see them wanting to do this as a way to promote the film without actually making the card better, sort of like when they gave the Prince an insignificant buff during the Prince's Dream season. To nobody's shock, Furnace was still a bottom 5 card for the remainder of 2020 despite the buff, and going into 2021 it actually briefly dropped to being the least used card in Grand Challenges. This Furnace rework couldn't come soon enough. It needed help. Or did it? While the community was waiting for the Fire Spirits rework, Furnace had a minor development in April. This Goblin Giant deck with Mother Witch and Goblin Hoe was trending for a brief period, showing Furnace was in fact still viable against all odds. Now you did see this deck getting some play back in December of the previous year, but it didn't have a notable impact on Furnace's performance because it wasn't widely used or very good yet. The Mother Witch was still pretty weak then, only finally getting buffed at the end of March, which explains why the deck started to really trend in April. The rates were still low, but it's a massive improvement. This was the most usage Furnace had seen in challenges in a year. Another notable thing to point out is that this deck had Furnace and Goblin HUD in it. Both cards had fairly similar functions, and had typically stepped on each other's toes. Multiple spawners in one deck wasn't really a thing in general since before the Furnace was even in the game, so this was a bit weird. Especially because Goblin HUD had been considered to be a weak card before this period as well. If a person had used a deck with multiple spawners in it up to this point, they easily would have been labeled as a troll or a noob, but this deck was certainly no joke. If Furnace just received a small buff, it actually could have been in a really good position again, which just makes this inevitable rework coming up seem like a mistake. But the Fire Spirits card was still doing horribly, and Supercell had their mindset on reworking it. So whether or not it was the best thing for Furnace, it was getting an overhaul. This rework would finally arrive in June 2021, and it was definitely one of the biggest reworks a card has ever received. Practically every one of its main stats would be changed. First, let's go over the Fire Spirit changes. Each Fire Spirit would now deal 6% more damage and have their hit points increased by 109%. Also, their splash radius would be increased by 0.8 of a tile, which was nearly a 50% increase. And finally, its jump range would be increased from 2 to 2.5 tiles. These were some major buffs that had big interaction changes. One of the biggest ones being that a single Fire Spirit could completely wipe out a center-placed Goblin Barrel, so Furnace could actually be used as a pretty good reactionary to it since you'd only be down 1 elixir and only had to sacrifice 1 wave. Another major one was that it would now take 3 tower shots to take out a Fire Spirit, so a single one could reach the tower on its own. And thanks to the jump range increase, it would be able to get the first attack against more cards including Baby Dragon and Bowler. Obviously, with each spirit being so much stronger, Furnace would have been insane if it spawned the same amount. So, firstly, the number of Fire Spirits spawned per wave was decreased to 1, and its total lifetime was decreased by 1 second. But, on the plus side, its spawn time interval was decreased by 2.9 seconds, meaning even with a shorter lifetime, it would spawn 2 more waves. Overall, the total damage output of all the spirits combined was more than 25% less than before. This sounds dramatic, but remember, it was almost impossible to get value out of all 12 spirits. If uninterrupted, you were getting 8 buffed Fire Spirit tower connections versus 6 weak ones, which was a 29% damage increase factoring in the damage buff, equating to 60% of the tower. However, there were a couple downsides. Like if you were trying to use Furnace as a reactionary against some beefier troops like Princess or Minion Horde, 1 wave wouldn't be enough to deal with them anymore. And obviously in situations where you could have something tank for the spirit like a Miner, you couldn't benefit from the damage of 2 spirits. As I said though, this rework was an overhaul, so there was no telling just from looking at this how well the card would perform. This was 7 stat adjustments, which is crazy for a card that wasn't even that bad of a position before. But this rework was so long planned and carefully curated that it seemed like the team knew what they were doing. Remember, they had announced that this rework was coming 9 months prior. Clearly they were doing their work behind the scenes. So how did the Furnace perform after this? Well, I think it's safe to say it was stronger. Fire Spirits were a much more consistent troop now. They had an easier time hitting all the troops in a swarm, and they connected way more often. Even though its performance was healthy though, I still feel like this rework went in a bad direction. Furnace spawning units in waves of 2 was neat because although you could get value out of it by itself, you could get extra value by properly playing and supporting it. It added some neat depth to a card that, let's be honest, didn't have a lot of depth to begin with. But those days were over. The Fire Spirits needed the rework, so Furnace was dragged along. The future wasn't clear at this point, but it seemed to be alright for now. Initially, we're seeing Furnace in the same kinds of decks you were seeing it in already, specifically control decks that often included Elite Barbarians and Mother Witch. The days of Royal Giant Furnace were over by this point. Mother Witch had filled the role Furnace previously played in these decks. Now, even though the Furnace was performing better, the usage didn't change as much as some people thought, which was surprising considering how massive of a rework this was. But that's likely what they were going for. They probably didn't want Furnace to be much stronger or weaker. They were just trying to do what they needed to do to accompany the new buffed Fire Spirit. It's nice that they actually took the time to ensure it was viable rather than just going overboard on the nerfs. Given how they've treated it at times in the past, it certainly wasn't a guarantee. Now, although things were looking smooth and steady for the Furnace, there was an issue that came along that certainly ensured Supercell was not done balancing it yet. You see, that Fire Spirit Goblin Barrel interaction I mentioned earlier was meta-changing. A 1 elixir cycle card being able to hard counter this 3 elixir secondary win condition made Goblin Barrel and thus the entire Logbait archetype unviable. It was an interaction that made a lot of people upset, thus it was no surprise that in the next set of balance changes, which came in September 2021, Fire Spirit splash radius was reduced from 2.5 to 2.3 tiles. It was a shame because Furnace essentially got punished for Fire Spirit's disruption. The Furnace Goblin Barrel interaction wasn't the main thing causing issues. Furnace was 4 elixir, not 1, and it was performing worse than the solo Fire Spirit. At this point though, it seems like a secondary consideration. Furnace didn't matter as long as the Fire Spirit was balanced out. Okay, I'm overblowing it a little bit. In this case, I actually agree with them not giving it a compensative buff because it only affected 1 interaction, and it was an interaction Furnace barely saw anyway. Plus, when the radius was increased by 0.2 of a tile back in September 2020, it barely made a difference, so going the opposite way wouldn't be much different. Furnace did see a small dip in usage following the change, but it certainly wasn't out of the meta. I know this might sound crazy, but I think this was actually the best position Furnace was ever in. Not best as in strongest, but as in best for the game. Furnace is a card that people don't really like, and I understand why. I don't usually like playing against it either, but I never want a card to be completely dead. So it being able to have a place in the meta while barely being disruptive feels like the best place for it to be. Unfortunately though, it wouldn't settle here. By November 2021, Furnace would have another major development. The usage was on the rise. This split lane pressure deck with Golden Knight became very popular, and you were seeing more decks utilizing the Goblin Hut Furnace combo in general. The community was definitely not happy about it. Furnace's performance may have been average statistically, but it was feeling very impactful. The hate towards this card was growing fast, and there were a lot of demands this month for a nerf or another rework. It was weird that despite the radius nerf, Furnace was doing the best it had been since its June 2021 rework. That rework may have worked out for the Fire Spirit, but at this point it was clear that it was not working for the Furnace. So in December 2021, it would receive another major rework. This was a major turning point for Furnace because following this rework, it wouldn't have anything close to competitively viable rates again. Let's go over it. Firstly, its hit points were decreased by another 17%, pretty much allowing Earthquake and Poison to fully counter it. Before, using them on it would still allow one last wave to squeeze out. Next up, its lifetime was decreased by a whopping 16 seconds, or nearly 1/3 of its lifetime. The interval between waves, however, would be decreased to 6 seconds, and finally, as a bonus, Furnace would get 1 Death Fire Spirit, nearly 2 years after they gave Barbarian and Goblin Hut death units. In total, the Furnace would now only spawn 7 Fire Spirits instead of 8 if uninterrupted. The shorter lifetime wasn't just bad because it couldn't spawn as many spirits, but because you couldn't stack Furnaces nearly as easily anymore, which was the main way to play it. Supercell themselves said in 2016 that they extended the lifetime so that you could stack them and build up pressure, and that was a big factor in it. That's typically why you saw it in cycle decks. Minor Cycle included it for a while, then Royal Giant Cycle, and even at this point, you certainly weren't seeing it in heavy decks. So the fact it lost this, plus a huge chunk of its hit points, was guaranteeing its death. This has always been an ability Furnace has had ever since that initial lifetime increase, so why was it such a problem now of all times, even more than when Furnace was first reworked in June 2021? Well, the new Champions rarity came out at the end of October 2021, and they changed the game in a big way. Only one of them can be on the battlefield at a time, so while you had one down, it was omitted from your card cycle. This meant it would only take 3 card placements to get back to your other cards after placing them. This was a very popular strategy referred to as 3-card cycle. Being able to get to your Furnace faster was a huge benefit, which is why you often saw it with Golden Knight in November. The thing that really baffles me about this rework is the hit point nerf. It seems like the biggest issue was stacking spawners, and now with 1/3 less lifetime, that was clearly not going to be an issue. It just seemed like overkill. I know people will argue it was for the death unit, but they already nerfed the spawner's HP years ago when it didn't get death units, so if anything, they finally could have made it fair. If all that wasn't bad enough, there's another nerf it would be getting that I didn't even mention yet, which is the Fire Spirit's jump range being reduced from 2.5 tiles back to 2 tiles. This is what allowed the spirits to get connections so consistently, so reverting this back was going to have a huge impact. Now, ranged cards could more consistently counter spirits again, and since they spawned quicker now, these defensive cards would be able to counter more waves before wandering into enemy territory. There was no question, Furnace was completely dead after this. Its use and win rate fell to the lowest they've been since before the June rework. Although Furnace does have a few minor developments left we need to cover, this is pretty much the end of Furnace's story. Supercell made up their minds that they did not want Furnace to be a part of the meta by taking away everything that made it strong and not looking back. 2022 was Furnace's worst year yet. There's nothing really to cover. It consistently remained as a bottom 5 card, maintaining some of the lowest use and win rates in the game, and it did not appear in any meta decks. It only got one balance change the entire year in August, but it wasn't a fix, rather a straight nerf. The Fire Spirit's damage would be decreased by 9%, meaning it actually did less than the old Fire Spirits now. This nerf was completely unnecessary for Furnace, but it was done because the 1 Elixir Fire Spirit was overperforming. This marks yet another instance in Clash Royale history of Furnace getting nerfed for no good reason. If Supercell cared even a little bit, they would have given Furnace something to compensate, but they didn't. What sucks even more is that this nerf arguably hurt Furnace more than the card they were actually trying to fix, because this nerf was meant to not have any major troop interaction changes, but just chip down towers slower. And Furnace's main purpose was to apply pressure and chip down towers when the Solo Fire Spirit was used in a wider variety of situations. This wasn't even the final nail in the coffin, it was just straight up beating a dead horse. The 5 remaining Furnace players were obviously disappointed, but the majority of the community really didn't care at this point. And just to really rub it in, both Barbarian and Goblin Hut received reworks in the preceding month in an attempt to bring them back into the meta. Even though they weren't very successful, just the notion that they would attempt to bring back other spawners and not Furnace, even though they shared the same problems, really shows how neglected and hated this card was now. Things weren't getting better in 2023, but Furnace did get another balance change, and this time it wasn't just a Fire Spirit change. More than 6 months after the last spawner reworks, and this would be the last balance change it's received to date. Finally, over a year since that devastating December 2021 rework, they were giving it some attention again. So what would they do after all this time to resurrect this mess of a building? They would give it another rework, but a much smaller one. Its lifetime was decreased by 5 seconds, but now the time between waves would be dropped from 6 to 5 seconds. Basically, they were going further with that December 2021 rework. Shorter lifetime, but the spirits spawn closer together. In their explanation, they say, with a slight increase to spawn speed, Furnace will become a more effective building all around. And I just don't understand this reasoning at all. Once again, I must reiterate, stacking multiple of this card is what made it good. Making the lifetime shorter isn't going to fix the issue here. You're just making it even easier for defensive cards to counter more waves. The part that really triggers me is the more effective all-around part, because that's just objectively not true. Sure, there may be a scenario where quicker spawns help, say, if you were using it on defense, or if the opponent was down on elixir, but for its main use, this was just not helpful whatsoever. It did not do anything to address any of the issues with Furnace, and it boggles my mind why they even bothered with it in the first place. To nobody's surprise, it was still underperforming following these changes. The rework, unsurprisingly, had almost zero effect. But there was another significant balance change that kept spawners in the discussion. You see, in the same set of balance changes, Spear Goblins got a range buff, which of course benefited Goblin Hut, and it was a little too much for this card, causing it to become a meta driver once again. This brought another massive wave of backlash of people calling for spawners to either be permanently nerfed into oblivion or even just straight up deleted. Just going to further show that even though it had been well over a year since Furnace was meta, the hate towards it was not dying down. Goblin Hut's rates weren't even that ridiculous. Sure, it was above average, but even in this very meta there were other cards with much higher use rates that nobody batted an eye towards. But Supercell got the message. Players don't want spawners. After obliterating the Goblin Hut in June 2023, none of the 4 main spawners received a balance change again, at least not one that affected the building itself. And that brings us to 2024, which has somehow been even worse for the Furnace. Possibly its worst year of all time, because this year would implement a new feature called Tower Troops. And the first one of these we got was the Cannoneer, who shot slowly but dealt significantly more damage per hit. He became very popular in early 2024, and why this matters is because it took away one of the Furnace's last few strengths. Since he dealt a lot of damage per shot, he could one-shot Fire Spirits, meaning when using Furnace against someone who had Cannoneer, you had to support the Furnace or else it would get 0 tower damage. Every other spawner could passively chip away at it in a one-on-one, even Tombstone. So if barely being able to stay alive on the field wasn't bad enough, now in some matches it could just be ignored with no consequences. Things didn't stop there, however. In April, the Dagger Duchess was introduced, and Furnace wasn't able to passively chip away at this one either. This tower troop was way more influential than Cannoneer, so the standard princess was practically unused competitively, making Furnace not chipping the tower the norm. Don't think it can get worse? Never underestimate the Clash Royale meta. The following month, we got a new card, the Void Spell, which was a 3 elixir spell that could completely wipe out a Furnace. Earthquake could already do this, and now a second and much more popular spell could do it as well. Granted, not as consistently since Void can be blocked, but it certainly didn't help. The very thought of using Furnace in anything was laughable. It now had the lowest use and win rate in Grand Challenges. It did bounce back slightly as all these new meta drivers were toned down, but still, as of the end of 2024, Furnace is one of the worst performing cards in Clash Royale. So what can be done about it? Can Furnace ever become viable again? I doubt Supercell will do anything, but I wanted to discuss a few potential routes. Firstly, the solo Fire Spirit has been performing horribly recently too, so a buff to the troop could be in order. If it were up to me, I'd revert the Spirit's jump range back to 2.5 tiles to match all the other spirits. Remember, they still do less damage than they did the last time they had this range, so it wouldn't be the same. But if you want to get a bit more radical, I had another idea in mind. If the lifetime and health must stay the same, then this card should simply spawn more Fire Spirits. And I'd say that can be done by increasing the number of spirit spawns per wave back up to 2, because originally in that June rework, Fire Spirits were so much stronger, but now with their jump range back to old and their damage even lower than before, it makes a bit more sense. The only thing that's still better about them is their health, so if this were to happen, both spirits could make it to the tower on their own. But since plenty of troops would be able to effectively counter them just the same and the building can still be spelled away in an instant anyway, I don't think it's that crazy. Especially because we're just talking about the interaction against Princess Towers. Cannoneer would still be able to counter 1 per wave, and Dagger Duchess could counter the first wave or 2 before needing to cool down. For the exact numbers, I'd increase the time between waves so it only spawned 5 instead of 6, and then get rid of the death unit. I know that last part would break consistency, but I don't think that's important here, and I think you could argue from a logical standpoint that it's different because barbarians and goblins live inside the huts, but the furnace generates the spirits. I know nothing like this will probably ever happen, but I've always been curious to see how spawners would work with tower troops in the mix. There is one more inevitable development to look forward to though, and that's its evolution. Supercell has been slowly rolling out evolutions for years now, and it's only a matter of time before it's Furnace's turn. I'm really curious to see how this works because we've yet to see a spawner evolution, unless you count the Goblin Drill, but that's different. Will we get an evolved Fire Spirit first and then have an evolved Furnace spawn evolved Fire Spirits, or will we get something a little more interesting? My prediction for the future is that when we eventually get an evolved Furnace at, say, about June 2026, it'll be decent for about a month or two, then nerfed into oblivion to be exactly where normal Furnace is today, because I don't think they're going to fix any core issues. I hope I'm wrong, but we'll just have to see. I'm curious to hear your thoughts though. Should Furnace be buffed at all, or is the game just better off without it? Also, let me know which card's history you want me to cover next. Thank you all for listening, and I'll catch you later.